Today, the place was the quiet town of Montgomery, Alabama.
Somebody's asking how long will prejudice blind divisions of men.
We face, therefore, a moral crisis as a country.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty! We are free at last!
Can't Look Away. Dialogues on photographs of the civil rights struggle bears witness to the violence of discrimination and segregation and to the daily hardships that Black Americans endured, living under Jim Crow laws. These indelible images from a collection of photographs made available to the Gund Gallery at Kenyon College evidence the enduring solidarity in the struggle for racial equality and justice in America from the 1960s. These photographs compel us to think deeply about the legacy of racism in the United States and about how the history that these images capture can inform the ways we respond collectively to the unresolved racial strife in our time. We find ourselves in this dangerous place not because something radically different has occurred in our nation's politics, but because so much has remained the same. We have witnessed many events that appear to move our nation toward racial reform, and yet our society and legal system seem relentlessly entrenched in cycles of racist brutality and control. In recent months, demonstrations and protests around the world, decrying the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, and demands for the end of violent and corrupt law enforcement, have shown that the persistence of institutionalized racism has brought our democracy to the threshold of crisis once again. We ask, what can we do as a campus community to participate in a broader collective effort to inspire progress at this critical moment? This is the guiding question for this Gund Gallery program, comprising a series of discussions on the topic of the continuing struggle for racial reform in the United States. The commentary provided by gallery staff, Kenyon College faculty, and other campus partners focuses on how we might respond to these commanding photographs. We are fortunate indeed to be able to call on the expertise of Kenyon's scholars in consideration of the topics as illuminated by these works. For this episode in our series, we welcome Austin Porter, Assistant Professor of Art History and American Studies at Kenyon, in conversation with Jodi Kovach, Curator of Academic Programs at the Gund Gallery, discussing two photographs by Charles Moore, Demonstrators Attacked with Water Cannons, Kelly Ingram Park, Birmingham, Alabama, May 6, 1963, and Birmingham, Alabama, Riot with Police Dogs, 1963. Let's join the discussion.
Austin, when I showed you a list of these photographs that we're considering, you identified these two right away as photographs you would like to discuss. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what drew you to these.
Yeah, I've used these photographs and photographs that are similar to these in my classes quite a bit for a couple of reasons. And honestly, in addition to the historical significance and the political significance that's associated with the scenes they depict, one of the things that really draws me to these is the way in which they were actually seen in 1963 and subsequently. And so that's one of the main points that really draws me back to these again and again is the sort of patterns of circulation of photographs. And so what we're seeing here are two scenes that occurred in Birmingham, Alabama in May of 1963, the first week of May that year. And the image here on the left happened first, almost certainly, and the image on the right happened a day or two after. And what we see on the left is a group of young African-American, mostly apparently males, who are being attacked by a water cannon that's being shot at them by the Birmingham Fire Department. And there's a lot of sort of symbolic associations that one can take from this, in the sense that these young men are sort of forcing themselves together, and this sort of solidarity against the overwhelming force of these fire hoses, which, by the way, were specifically outfitted to shoot twice as much water as a normal water cannon. The authorities knew that these demonstrations were happening, and they designed this cannon specifically as an act of state-sponsored violence against the demonstrators. Reportedly, these cannons could take tree bark off a tree at 100 yards and could break bones if used close enough to their human victims. So one of the things that, in addition to all of that, one of the things that really strikes me about that is we only see the demonstrators. We don't see the actual members of the fire department that are directing this water against the demonstrators here. There's also something to be said about the fact that there's a lot of sort of strength to be gained from the relative anonymity of the participants here. No participant is sort of prioritized over another. Many of the figures are rather anonymous. And so there's a sort of strength in that sort of understanding this social movement through that group action where we don't see sort of a leader figure necessarily, aside from the figure on the sort of left side that sort of seems to be coming up. And then the work on the right, as I said, happened a day or two after. And after the demonstrators refused to stop marching in Birmingham, the police ordered German Shepherds and dogs, German Shepherds, to be used in quelling these demonstrations. And so this, unlike the work on the left, as I said, it actually does show the state authorities that were using violence to suppress these civil rights demonstrators. And this is a pretty dynamic shot in the sense that sort of in the midground you have this traffic line, this white traffic line that cuts at about a 35 or 40 degree angle that sort of gets to this rather haphazard, violent nature of the scene here. And in the middle of the scene is this, you see the back of a sort of young or middle-aged African-American man who's being attacked by more than one dog. His left pant leg has been ripped, and there's a dog who is tearing at the right side of his back pants. And the entire scene is sort of framed by police officers who have billy clubs and have shepherds on their leashes here. And so this is different from the previous image because you see representatives of the state local authorities, but it also suggests this kind of haphazardness of the scene, the sort of sense of quote unquote being there, right? And this was achievable because Charles Moore, the photographer, was able to get really close. He was in the street. This is not the result of some kind of high-definition lens. He had a reputation of running towards violence, of running towards where the action was, and was able to get this kind of effect because he was sympathetic with the demonstrators, but he also wanted to be able to achieve an effective image. So that's some things that I'm interested in. Right,
right. A lot of those qualities and characteristics about these photographs interest me too. The fact that Charles Moore had a background as a photographer while he was serving in the U.S. Marines, and then he went on to have a freelance career photographing the wars in Vietnam, Dominican Republic, conflicts in Haiti and Venezuela. He really does put us in the midst of this chaos. Mm-hmm. And it's astonishing to really think about the fact that he was right there and was able to capture these moments. I know as art historians, we oftentimes talk about the veracity of photography in representing a historical moment. What we see within the frame doesn't tell the whole story necessarily, but there's something about these two photographs, I think, that it convey the authenticity of the moment, of the violence that was enacted on these demonstrators. And I noticed that you also referred to these as demonstrations because these were peaceful demonstrators, and the police, the fire department responded with excessive and extreme force.
Yeah, and that was something that the civil rights movement, the organizers of the civil rights movement were well aware of. They had anticipated this level of severity from the authorities in Birmingham. So just from a technical standpoint, Moore was using a 35 millimeter camera, which was very small, had a really effective, technologically speaking, it allows him to get up and close and personal, right? And to take multiple exposures subsequently. And that gets to be significant specifically for the work on the right, because as these photographs, as with other still photographs, it provides this instant, but it doesn't provide the before and after. But the work on the right with the dogs, we do have several photographs that were taken over a series of seconds, which provide this almost cinematic sort of quality. And I use that term cinematic with great hesitation because I think that can sort of emphasize unnecessarily the aesthetic value of these kinds of photographs, which will arguably sort of detract their historical significance and the importance of the socio-political sort of history that's associated with these. But to get to your point about the violence, as I said, the civil rights organizers knew that Birmingham was a notoriously racist city. Mm-hmm. In the early 1960s, it had a population of about 350,000, 40% of which were African American. It was overwhelmingly blue collar, and Martin Luther King and the other prominent civil rights leaders knew about this terrible reputation. Even President Kennedy at the time had called Birmingham, I think he called it the worst city in America, because of its reputation, which was deserved. And by the early 60s, when federal law had mandated integration of public spaces, Birmingham authorities elected to close down public schools, or not public schools, but public parks, public pools, public golf courses, anything that was public rather than desegregate. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, there was a really important local authority, Eugene Bull Connor, very well known, not just as a racist, but also for using violence against demonstrators. So the participants, the demonstrators here, knew what they were in for. Mm-hmm. The leaders knew what they were in for. And so these photographs really helped, arguably, to argue for the cause of civil rights, advancing civil rights legislation, because this showed the level of violence that was happening in southern cities that much of the rest of the country, or at least a portion of the rest of the country, as well as the rest of the world, did not believe, right? Right. And so that gets into a whole other sort of conversation about reception and audience of these images.
Sure. And I think that's an important conversation. These were published in Time just shortly after the incidents happened, if I'm not mistaken, in May of 1963, or excuse me, Life magazine. Right. Sorry. Charles Moore worked for Black Star, mm-hmm. which was often contracted by Life magazine, and they were distributed internationally. So the Birmingham campaign and Charles Moore's photographs helped make a significant difference in global understanding of the struggle in the South.
Yeah, absolutely. So Moore, he grew up in a little town about 90 minutes northwest of Birmingham. And as you mentioned, he was in the Marines after World War II. He went to art school in California, in the early 50s, I think, and then by the late 50s, he had returned to Birmingham and was a staff photographer for 2 different local newspapers. And he did a series of photographs where he captured the arrest of Martin Luther King, and those images sort of gained him a little bit of clout and a little bit of notoriety, and that led to his subsequent leaving Alabama for Black Star in New York City, which Black Star in itself is fascinating. It's a picture agency that started by a small group of European immigrants in the mid-20th century. I think it was in the 30s or 40s. And basically they were like this clearinghouse between freelance photographers and publications. And so Black Star, as you said, was associated not just with Life, but the whole Henry Luce publishing sort of machine, which included Time, Life, and then also Fortune. Which were all really, really significant, not just for news, but also the way in which visual culture itself had changed in the United States. And this is one thing that I mean, honestly, this is one of the reasons why I was so excited about these, is because the work on the right appeared in Life. Yeah. It is very, very well known. The work on the left I honestly cannot think of a place where it was reproduced in mass. But the work on the right is very well known for appearing in the May, I want to say 15th or 16th issue of 1963 issue of Life magazine. So it's about 2 weeks after the events actually happen. This photograph and a series of other photographs taken by Moore ran in Life. And this is a really big deal because Life was a really big deal. And it's difficult in talking to students to really reinforce or to even explain the significance of Life magazine. Life magazine, I mean, it starts in 1936, and it is a large format picture magazine that is fairly affordable and has almost immediately a very, very high circulation. And nothing like this had really happened in the United States before. I mean, we had magazines for a very long time, but this came at a moment when it's the middle of the Depression and people don't have much money, and so to buy something that was relatively affordable, that was full of entertainment, full of news, full of sports, full of any kind of content you can imagine, it very quickly became very, very popular. And so it achieved a wide, it's even difficult to determine what its readership actually was, because we know that it had this, what's referred to as a pass-along rate. I would have a subscription and then I would lend it to you and you would give it to someone else. And so we do know that it was really significant across the US, Life magazine was. And so that was really one of the reasons why I was so drawn to this, because of who saw it and how they saw it. You know, that people didn't see this image in an art gallery or a museum. They saw it in Life magazine, alongside tons of advertising, alongside all different kinds of news coverage, sports, movies, whatever. And so that really, as I said, it had a profound impact because it sort of showed what it was like to be a civil rights demonstrator, what it was like to be African American in a city that, again, Kennedy referred to as the worst in the United States. And so Life magazine, huge, huge, and the fact that Moore was associated with that publication really took that image specifically on the right to a whole nother level.
Right, and you've mentioned to me before that it would be really valuable having these in an exhibition in an art museum, to have the Life magazine copy alongside it or displayed to create that context. I think you're absolutely right. It's so important to know how this was originally received widely. And now we're thinking about it in the framework of this discussion, and potentially later on in an exhibition, large-scale exhibition with many photographs portraying the civil rights movement. But and I know that you teach about this particular photograph in your art history classes, in talking about how Andy Warhol took it into a completely different context. He created these silkscreen paintings using the police riot with dogs and reproduced them in different colors and different scale, and the titles he gave them, such as Mustard Race Riot or Red Race Riot or Small Race Riots, really emphasized color and scale over the other qualities. I mean, he denotes that these were race riots, but I wonder if you want to comment on how you talk about that with your students.
Yeah, so the year after these are published, Warhol does this series, which he referred to as Death in America. And it included not just scenes of what he referred to as race riots, but also things like pictures of electric chairs, pictures of suicides, pictures of traffic accidents. He was really interested in all different kinds of sensationalism and drama, etc. And as we were talking about, and we have talked about, previously, this sort of the significance of the appropriation of mass media, of entering into the high art context, of sort of pushing the boundaries of what could be considered fine art. I mean, this had happened before with different artists, but Warhol, because he was clearly taking these images and then using them, reproducing them through a silkscreen process, which is had been invented in the 30s specifically for advertising, or at least used widespread in the 30s for advertising, sort of is a step further away from the traditions of fine art. It's he's using a machine-generated image and then reproducing it with another machine, and he's doing so with a group of studio assistants at his so-called factory studio. And so there's a couple of different things going on here. First of all, mass media and contemporary news are entering the world of contemporary art. And for a long time, that was the sort of thing that critics and a lot of patrons weren't necessarily too excited to see, right? From a content standpoint, this is news, it's not art, right? Would be one of the critiques. But in addition to that, he has, as you mentioned, this sort of tendency to repeat the images over and over again. And to do so deliberately so that different amount of ink actually hit the canvas. And so some are over inked and some are relatively evenly inked and some are very, very faint. And so there's this sort of question of not only is he pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable for contemporary art, but is he sort of sensationalizing violence to the point that we develop this sort of apathy to it, right? And I mean, there's a very massive amount of scholarship that goes along with that sort of desensitization that not just Americans, but any audience might be able to take from these images or otherwise. But they did raise this sort of issue about the acceptable content for contemporary art, and arguably bring this important subject matter into spaces where it otherwise wouldn't have been addressed. That is, museums, galleries, etc. In addition to the Warhol angle, that interests me about both of these, but specifically, well, actually both of these, is some of what it's sort of been referred to in some ways as a sort of myth of passivity that goes along with the civil rights movement in general. There's this sort of belief that the demonstrators and others that were involved with the civil rights movement were, constantly just sort of taking these beatings and were doing so in a very passive sort of way. And you can make an argument that both of these photos sort of reinforce that that attitude or that stereotype that, oh, look at these demonstrators, they're being beaten, they're being hit with fire hoses, etc. And that's problematic because in reality, the civil rights movement was highly organized. The demonstrators knew exactly what they were doing. The organizers knew what they were doing, right? And so this really sort of unfortunately reinforces this some negative stereotypes of docility, of not understanding, the power of the state, etc. there's a related argument that goes along with that about the way in which these images would have been received by different white audiences. So in general, it's easy for us to look at these now and say, this is terrible. You know, I mean, obviously, these people are being beaten. They're being hit with fire hoses. This is awful. You know, very difficult images to look at. And in that way, it's garnering support for the civil rights movement, right? It's not difficult to see these and for us to imagine a viewer thinking, this must be stopped. This is heinous. How can this happen in this country? But when you begin to sort of break down different demographics in the US, you can also make an argument for, say, northern whites reading these images in a different way than southern whites. And what I mean by that, this is an argument that's advanced by Martin Berger, who's a professor at UC Santa Cruz, and he talks about how northern whites that are reading Life magazine could look at this and say, this is terrible, but it's not happening here. Right. That in the North, we don't have these problems. You know, everything's fine here in Philly or Boston or wherever, right? And of course, that's not true, right? I mean, there was different forms of racism then and now in different parts of the country. And so this, arguably, these kinds of images, again, specifically that on the right that was in Life, arguably gave even moderate to liberal whites sort of license to distance themselves from this kind of violence, which is a real problem, right? Because, I mean, one thing that I was thinking about is that, again, I hate to keep going back to the image on the right, but that was the one that was shown widely in Life. I mean, it's a very powerful image. It's eye-catching. It's dynamic. I mean, aesthetically speaking, as I said, it's cinematic, right? It has this real sort of energy to it. And in so doing, it's very effective at, again, showing a specific moment that something is wrong, right? Clearly, something is not right with the society that this is happening. But what it fails to convey is the much more systemic, problematic aspects of segregation and racism in the country at the time, right? It's difficult to display inequalities in education, in labor, in housing, et cetera, in a single photograph, right? Yes. And so this is kind of the problem with this kind of image, is that this sells newspapers, right? Exactly. And it does so very well. But it also doesn't encapsulate the actual goals of the movement, which was to ensure that institutions in Birmingham were desegregated, right? I mean, this does not address this kind of image does not address the economic inequality that African Americans were experiencing at the time. And some of that is shown in other photographs of the civil rights movement. And I'm talking about, you know, economic boycotts, the sit-ins, demonstrations outside City Hall, et cetera, which again, we tend to associate with as being sort of more nonviolent and passive, but in reality, it was a proactive movement from, not from beginning to end necessarily, but it did evolve over time, but to think of it as purely passive is really oversimplifying things.